It's time to trim our blocks to size and assemble the quilt top on our Twilight Boulevard bench pillow. I have all of my blocks ready to press and trim and sew together. So the first thing I do need to do is press all of these blocks. Now with the main block, since I used muslin as my stabilizer, I will press mostly from the back. But if I do need to turn over and press, if there's some extra pressing on the front, I need to make sure to cover it with the pressing cloth if there is anything that needs to be covered. So usually I just do that as a habit. But muslin press is so nice, and it can take the high heat of a dry iron. So I will press all of these. Now with the borders, I do have both the inner and outer borders with no-show mesh, and so I will press these from the front most likely. I will cover with a pressing cloth since I have not cut this, and no-show mesh tends to kind of stick to the iron. It definitely doesn't press as nice as muslin, so I will cover and press from the front for both of the borders. All right, so I'm going to get all of these pressed and then we can start trimming. I have a quick note about trimming these blocks. Normally, if the background quilting does not travel into the seam allowance, which would be between these two stitching lines, the batting placement and the tack down of the fabric, if no background quilting goes into that seam allowance, I will remove the tack down and remove any stabilizer back next to the batting. But because this background quilting does travel into that seam allowance, I am not going to remove that because I can't remove it all. And so I am not going to be taking my tack down. I will actually use that as a guide to trimming. So for me, I can go ahead and just start to immediately press. All right, let's get these pressed. Now that these are pressed, I am going to trim these. All of the larger center blocks I can trim with an orange pop ruler. They are designed for exactly this size. However, you can just use a regular ruler. I'm going to show you, I'm going to use a combination of my orange pop ruler and a regular ruler for the smaller blocks. But if you're going to do more than one project for Kimberbell, these rectangle or square sets of orange block rulers really come in handy. Now, with the tack down, that's the tack down of the outer fabric, I'm going to use that as a guide to center my orange pop ruler. Now, sometimes the tack down gets pulled in a little bit, and you might be able to see kind of at the top, I can see that it kind of dips down, maybe even in here. There's a lot going on these blocks, and so if you're using a regular ruler, you can't always just trim on the tack down line. You would need to measure. These need to measure 6.5 by 8.5, these larger blocks, and then you can trim them. Again, you can see this kind of pulls up. Now, I could have used a darker thread just for the placement and tack down of the fabric. That would have been helpful, but I wanted to use the same, so I just had to change thread less because I use the same color to tack down as I did the background quilting. However, it is easier to see if you use a darker color. So for these blocks, the most important is to trim the bottoms of the houses or the trees 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of the actual embroidery design. And so while I'm going to use this as a guideline, I'm not concerned with the top. I will line this ruler up with the sides, and again, I know it might be hard to see because it is kind of light. I'll line up the sides, but then the most important for the top and bottom is that I'm 1/4 of an inch. So I do measure. Normally I don't really measure, I just kind of eye everything. I am going to measure so I can keep as consistent as I can. So I have just a little seam gauge. I'm going to put it at 1/4. And I want to measure 1/4 of an inch. So I would take, I'm lined up left to right, and I would take this and just put my little plastic on the bottom of that little foundation stitch. Now this is a little bit higher, this cupcake. I'm, okay if a hair bit of that goes into the seam allowance, or I could measure from the bottom of this and have this just above. I think I'm going to measure from this though, and I think that looks good. So that's where I need to be on the bottom. And then I'm going to spin it back around, which this spinning mat is the best. It's a good investment. It's not, super cheap, but it like spins. It's different than any spinning mat out there, I think. I think there's one other that's a pink mat. I have a smaller version, but I don't know if it comes in a large version like this. Anyways, I love this. So now I'm set down here. And I'm not sure you can see, but I can see that stitching, did come up a little bit. There's a lot going on. And then I'm just going to make sure again that I'm centered the best I can. Doesn't have to be perfect. You're going to see a little bit because of the quilting pulling in. So I think that looks good. And so to use these orange pop rulers, I always steady with one finger before I just put my hand down because that can twist. So I usually will just lightly put a finger on this kind of at the same time and press down so that it doesn't spin, so that the ruler doesn't spin. Then I am just going to take it. It's just like a regular ruler. It seems different when you first get these because you're cutting kind of to the inside, but you're still, if you're right-handed, you're cutting to the right of, essentially, this would be a ruler. And so you just cut like a normal ruler. It just seems different because you are kind of cutting on the inside anyways. So I am going to trim that. Then before I just lift up so that I don't twist and get that out of alignment, I steady again at the same time and pick up. Then I spin. I'll steady at the same time and put my hand down. Cut this. Now sometimes, because these have little notches that your ruler goes into, sometimes you don't get them quite into the corner. So usually it's just a thread. So I'll come back and just cut that. Especially because I'm cutting my muslin. Normally, again, I take my stabilizer out, if at all possible. All right, so there is our first cute block cut. All right, so that's how I'm going to cut all of these. I'm going to measure the bottom, center between the left and the right, as good as possible, and cut. For these thinner blocks, there's a couple of ways I can trim these. Of course, I can just trim with a regular ruler. I would, again, just need to make sure that if you're using the tack down as a guideline, only a guideline, measure to make sure that you are cutting the correct size, because if I take it, the top and the bottom are usually the least pulled in. They're the, by the corners. But I'm just a hair off. I mean, it's so close, these top pieces, to 4.5 inch wide. These need to be 4.5 by 8.5. So I'll measure down here, and it's a little bit off. So I would, again, cut your 1/4 inch first, because that's a given. We know that that can be 1/4 inch. You could line up, a 1/4 inch mark on your ruler this way and trim, and then you could work your way around. That's the most important. And then once you have that 1/4 inch trimmed off, you would just need to measure up 8.5, no matter where this tack down falls, and then trim the width to 4.5. I am going to use 2 orange pop rulers. So the ruler that I use to cut all of these larger blocks is the correct height. All of these, of course, are going to be the same height. So what I can do is, again, the most important measurement for me to look at is the bottom, making sure it's about 1/4 inch from the bottom of this pole. And I kind of go to the outside. I'm not sure if the pumpkin lines up exactly. It's pretty close. That looks pretty close to the bottom of the little flower. So I could use all of those as kind of a guide, because I don't have a long, piece like I do on the houses. And so that looks good. There's my 1/4 inch. You can see my little plastic thing lines up right with the bottom of that. If I take it to this side, and that lines up with the bottom of that, and the pumpkin is also. So I know that this is the height. Of course, I'm only concerned because my block's skinnier. So I am going to go ahead and cut my top and bottom, because I can use my ruler. So now I can just cut these off to get these out of the way. So I have the height of my block. Now again, I could use a regular ruler and just measure and cut 4.5 inches. But I also have an orange pop ruler that is 4.5 inches wide, but it's only 6.5 inches tall. So I need just the left and the right side from this ruler. But of course, it's not going to cut my whole entire block. So I am going to line up the cut edge that I cut 1/4 inch with my ruler, and then line up the right and the left side. Because now, of course, I'm not concerned about the top and the bottom, because I've already cut that. I'm just getting the width of the block, and I'm trying to line it up as straight as I can, or as even. I'm going to have a little bit showing because it was pulled in, and I just kind of want to split that difference. So that looks good. So now I'm just going to cut, and again, it's not going to cut the full block. So I have that cut like that. Now I can just take a regular ruler, or I could just take the orange pop ruler from the outside and finish these cuts. So what I would do, again, trying to make sure I'm as straight as can be, I would line up a lot along the edge that I just cut. I would line up with the top to make sure that I'm not tilted, since I have to do this kind of piecemeal. And then I would finish just cutting that last bit off. And again, you could use just a regular ruler. And then the same thing with this side. I'll line up you know, a lot with this to make sure that I'm as straight as I can be. Line it up with this edge and cut that couple inches. So now it's, of course, the same height, but it's a little bit smaller, a little bit skinnier. All right, so that's how I'm going to cut this last block. Alright, so I'm going to sew these together, and I'm just going to look at the book and put these in order. Now, I don't really need to clip these to sew them, but I'm going to clip them so that I can keep track of what side I'm stitching, so I don't have to double check. So the first is this little pumpkin with the flower on the left, so it's this one. This other thin one will be very right. Then it's the cute little Bella's Boutique. Then it's the tree with the bench. Then the bakery. Then the candy corn quilt shop. The plain tree, and then this. So again, I don't really need to clip them to sew, but if I clip, I don't have to like double check that I'm sewing on the right side or I'm sewing the right one. So I will just clip, and of course it does help to keep things straight. And then I'll just set that so I know I'm going to stitch on the right hand side. These two need to go together. So I'll go sew, and then once I sew, I can, you know, put the two sets together and then add this last one on, and then I will come back and press all of the seams open. And I'm just going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam. When I press the seams open, I use this little, it's called a strip stick. I just bought it on a website, a quilting shop website. However, they do have their own site called the strip stick. And it's just a kind of a rounded piece of wood. It's a hardwood, probably like oak or something. It has batting and then this little muslin top. And this is super hard, and so when I press the seams open, I can press and get them as flat as I can. Of course, when you press on a wool mat, this kind of gives, and so sometimes, especially when you have a lot of layers, this comes in really handy. This also comes in handy when you're doing just regular quilt blocks that have other seams. It kind of elevates the seams so you don't mess up those, and I've used this a lot when I do my regular quilts. So I'm just going to simply open these up, and again, there is both the muslin and of course the background fabric in the seam allowance. I usually will just take a little bit of Best Press, or I have other sprays, and I'll just put a little bit down the center to help get a nice You can hear that sizzle. That's probably a lot of Best Press. And then I can press really hard because the strip stick is very firm and it won't give. And so I can get really nice edges. And that one flipped over, but you can see how nice that was. I'm gonna spray that a little bit since I kind of got that to the wrong side. But you can see how nice already that seam is. So what I normally do is I will press on this stick, and I am pressing down really firmly, and then I will take my clapper, just still on the strip stick, so I can again press firm and then just kind of cool it off. And then if I feel like I need to kind of press everything, I've got a nice flat seam. And there's my start of my bench pillow. All right, I'm going to do that to all of these seams. My gosh, this is so cute. So we have everything sewn together. That is so cute. All right, so now let's work on the inner borders. I pressed the borders with a little bit of best press. I did press from the front, and I covered with a pressing cloth because I still have my no-show mesh larger than my fabric, and so I don't want that to stick to my iron or melt. I use my iron on the highest setting, and for the no-show mesh that I use, it can melt it. Now, you can turn your iron down if you don't want to have to worry about a pressing cloth, but I use a pressing cloth. So now with the borders, there are two ways that I can treat these. I can just cut the stabilizer off right next to the fabric, leave this tack down in, and stitch that to my quilt top. I think I am going to remove the stabilizer from the seam allowance, and so that would be taking the stabilizer all the way back to where the batting is, so that there is no stabilizer in the seam allowance. It'll just be the fabric. And so for borders, this outside line was the fabric placement. That's where I lined up my fabric. So it's not attached to anything other than the stabilizer, but that showed me where to place my fabric. The inside line, of course, is the batting placement. And then there's a line of stitching that goes right in the center of those two down the seam allowance. And that is the tack down of the fabric. It jumps in. And so again, I could easily just trim the excess off, and it would essentially look like that. There would be stabilizer, and then when I sew this to the quilt, sometimes I do that. Today I think I'm going to take this out, and mostly because on one of my pieces I had the tack down of the fabric did not catch for almost the whole piece right here, and so I already have that out. So I'm just going to remove that from all of these. And so essentially then if I remove this, just like this didn't tack down, then I can trim the stabilizer back to the batting so that there's no stabilizer in my seam allowance, because my seam will be sewn right next to the batting. So that was easy to get out because it didn't catch. What I normally do, and a super easy way to take this out, is come to the back, and there's going to be knots, and I'm looking to take out this center. I don't need to, worry about anything else. It's just that center line. So I'm going to cut the bobbin thread of that center stitching line and just pull a little bit out so that I can grab a hold. And this is how I normally do all of my blocks when I don't have quilting that goes into the seam allowance. That wasn't the case for this, for my larger blocks. So I'll just pull 4 or 5 stitches out so I can grab that piece. Now with borders, I need to come to where the border ends because there's another knot, and I need to also find that bobbin and cut the bobbin thread. So once I have it cut on both ends, I have a little bit pulled out so I can grab a hold. I can just hold down here and pull that bobbin. Sometimes. Sometimes you have to do it. That one broke, so let me see. For the most part, you can just slide that bobbin right out. Okay, I don't know why that was caught up, but so I have the bobbin, and if I hold it, you can see I can just pull it, and it pulls right out for most of the time. So then when I turn it to this side, this now is just free, and I can take that. Now with the borders, this knot needs to be cut on both the top and the bottom because I want to fold this back. You know, right now it's still attached in the seam allowance. So I'll just fold that back and cut that little knot. So now it's back, and then I can take scissors and cut that. So let me come up to this other end. I'll pull this. That one's out. So then what I would do once I have all that tack down out is I could use a trimmer by George, but with borders I usually find it faster just to use my scissors. So I just will slide my scissors, of course not cutting my fabric, and I will just trim right next to the batting. You can see there's a batting placement, you can see the batting, and I just trim that stabilizer away. So now I don't have any of that in my seam allowance, and I will do that just to both sides of the border. Okay, I want to try one more time because that was a lot harder than it normally is. So on this other side, I have cut the bobbin on both, you know, ends because they're both knotted, and I've pulled out a little bit so I can grab a hold of the bobbin. And it's, you know, just cut way down here. And so now you can see how normally it's that easy. I'm not sure what I was getting caught up on that. But again, that just comes right out. Then I can come to this side and pull that tack down out. And then I will cut that out. All right, that's how normally it's easy to get out. All right, I'm going to continue. To line up the border, I can either start at one end of the inner border and just work my way down and cut off whatever's extra. I decided that I think I'm going to center, so here's the center block, this little bakery, and I am going to center one of the tricks and treats wording. I'm not, you know, going to measure anything, but I want the tricks or treats. I think I'm going to look at this big round piece of candy and kind of center, or put this candy, you know, kind of in the center. If I wanted to measure, this should be 6 inches. Now that we've sewn these together, it is. So the 3-inch mark, if I wanted to line it up with that candy, that's how I'm going to do mine, so I have that. But you can do it anyway. There's I don't know, 2.5 inches at least to kind of play with on each end. So that's how I'm going to do mine. So I am just going to take this, flip it down, and I have all my stabilizer removed, and I'm just going to line it up with the quilt, and I am going to clip. I also like to clip where the seams are pressed open. And I try not to stretch this inner border. I try just to, kind of like when I was stitching the borders, I kind of like to pat and make sure that it's nice and flat without stretching. Alright, so I am just going to clip, and I will do the same thing for the bottom. I will probably line it up exactly the same way. So if here's my tricks or treats, here's the center, that center little candy. If I want to measure, the 3 inches is about right here. That's about right. And then I will just do the same thing and just make sure you're, you know, doing a right reading. So I usually place it how I want and then flip it up. Now you could adjust these if you didn't want the tricks and treats, you know, exactly lined up or the border lined up. You could shift them down. It doesn't matter. However you want to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and clip this side as well, and then I will take this to my sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch. Now when I sew these, I am going to sew from the right side of the blocks for the top, but I think on the bottom I'm going to flip this upside down so that when I'm sewing, I'll start at this end, and I kind of have a guide to make sure I'm hitting the bottoms of, you know, the houses and the trees as best as I can. All right, I'm gonna go sew these. These borders look really good, and I'm ready to trim the edges so that I can put my top borders on, because those are closer to the size. So I want to go ahead and square these up, but you can see how cute this border is. Now I did press towards the inner border, so I pressed from the front. I used a pressing cloth on the bottom. I didn't really need one on the top. I was just careful not to go on the few things, but I didn't really need a pressing cloth. On the bottom I definitely did, and I just folded this over, and that will press the seam towards the border. So now I'm just going to take a large ruler and line it up along this edge and try to get a line or a mark on my ruler along the seam to make sure that I'm as straight as I can get. I'm not quite straight on this. I have a little bit down here, so what I'm going to do is measure with this that's a little bit smaller, line this up with the seam on the small inner border, and I can see that my mark is along the top border, so I know that I'm, you know, not slanting. And I've got a little bit extra here to cut, and I will just cut both. And then I just had a little bit that I wasn't quite straight. So there is, those are straightened up, and then I am ready to attach the top border. I'll do the same thing to the other side. And I love this purple. I'm glad I chose it. All right, so again, I'll line it up with this to start. And again, I'm a hair smaller at the top, so I'm going to scooch it over just a little bit. I'm lined up along the bottom seam. I'm lined up along the top seam, so I know that I'm straight. And I have just a little bit to trim off. And now it's time to put the outer borders on. That's looking so cute. Again, I love the purple. It really brings out, of course, all the purple in the quilt. I'm really not a purple person. I love it though. Looks great. Now for these borders, I am not going to take the stabilizer all the way out of the seam allowance. I have it out on the inner border, and so when this attaches, for example, if this attaches to the inner border, this is going to be pressed towards the inner border, so I don't really mind that there's a stabilizer. On the outer edge, I want there to be stabilizer so that it just gives my edge a little bit more stability when I'm doing my binding. So for these, all I'm going to do is just trim the stabilizer right next to the fabric. Now again, my fabric is not the most even because this was again done differently, so I'm going to do my best. All right, so I'm just going to trim right along and get that stabilizer off. So with the outer border, it fits pretty much exact, and so I squared up the edge just to make sure that, you know, I was straight as could be, and then I just clipped it and it fits pretty exact. So I think that's why Kimberbell now on the ends makes them a little bit longer so that you have a little bit of wiggle room to trim. All right, so I'm going to trim this off. I'm going to straighten this out. However, remember this will be in the binding, so I don't need to be exact. I think I'm going to trim even with the batting just to, that's kind of peeking out, just to make sure I have enough and that I'm not short. But I'll square that up, and then I will do this, just do the same thing. I'm just going to line it up and clip it and see how it looks. All right, and then I'm going to go sew 1/4 of an inch and our top will be done. When I press, I am going to press the seam towards the inner border. So I will flip it over. I'll have to use a pressing cloth because I have no show mesh, and I use the hot iron, and then I will just press the seam towards the inner border. I've stitched the outer borders on, so the top is done. I did press the seams towards the inner border. And I have to say, I love this quilt. Now, I think I mentioned in my last video with the outer borders that purple really wasn't my favorite color. It was probably my least favorite. And I think I'm going to revisit that because I think the purple in this quilt makes this quilt. This is so fun. I love this quilt. The colors, just the bright orange and the purples, and of course the black. I love it. All right, so our whole quilt top is done except for a couple of the 3D embellishments, a little pillow and a little quilt. I will do those later. But now all I need to do is attach the backing, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch and do a binding since I am not making this into a pillow. If you're making it into a pillow, then you would just follow the directions. I believe it has an envelope backing so that you would just sew the backing, you know, right sides together. The envelope backing is open. It has folds so that you can sew all the way around, and then you just flip it out like you would a pillow, and that's how you would finish it. Of course, mine is a wall hanging, and I'm going to do mine a little bit different. All right, so the top is done, and I adore it.